Here's a paradox that should stop you cold. Venezuela's oil production has collapsed so badly from 3 million barrels a day to less than 1 million that removing it from global markets barely moves prices. Yet the most powerful country on earth just launched a military operation to control it. Most explanations focus on Maduro, on human rights, on restoring democracy. Those explanations are comfortable. They're also incomplete. This isn't about one dictator or one arrest. This is about a financial architecture worth trillions, and what happens when someone threatens to price oil outside the dollar. To understand why America really moved on Venezuela, we need to follow the money to places the headlines will never take you. The headlines have already moved on. Maduro is in custody. The press conferences are finished. Cable news has found new outrage. But the real operation, the one that will reshape energy markets and financial systems for the next decade, is just beginning. And almost nobody is talking about it. Carlos Mendoza still remembers the exact moment he understood his country was never coming back. He was standing in the control room of a PDVSA refinery in Punto Fijo, watching pressure gauges that hadn't worked properly in months. It was 2018. He was 43 years old, a petroleum engineer with 20 years of experience, and he was being asked to run a facility that was literally falling apart around him. The pumps were Soviet-era equipment that nobody knew how to repair. The skilled technicians had fled to Colombia, to Houston, to anywhere that still paid in real currency. Carlos was earning the equivalent of $8 a month, not enough to buy food for his family, let alone maintain infrastructure worth billions. That night, he made a decision. He walked out of the refinery, drove home, packed 2 suitcases, and joined the exodus. Today, Carlos lives in Texas, working for an American oil services company. He earns more in a week than he made in a year back home. Why does his story matter? Because Carlos is exactly the kind of person American companies will need to rebuild Venezuela's oil industry. And somewhere in Houston right now, recruiters are already making lists. Picture a map of the Western Hemisphere. Now draw lines connecting 4 seemingly unrelated pressure points: Greenland with its rare earth minerals, the Panama Canal with its shipping choke points, Canada with its trade disputes, and Venezuela with its oil reserves. Most analysts treat these as separate stories. Different regions, different issues, different timelines. They're wrong. These are all one story, one strategic logic playing out across an entire hemisphere. Here's the question nobody in mainstream coverage is asking. If Venezuela's oil production is so low that it barely matters to global supply, why did the United States just spend military resources to change its government? The answer isn't about barrels. It's about what currency those barrels are priced in. Maria Santos was a banker in Caracas before everything collapsed. 41 years old, educated at Columbia University, she managed accounts for Venezuela's elite government officials, military officers, businessmen connected to the regime. Her clients had a combined net worth of roughly $2 billion. None of that money was in Venezuela. Maria remembers the exact meeting when she realized how the system actually worked. A general walked into her office, dropped a briefcase containing $400,000 in cash, and asked her to wire it to a shell company in Panama. When she asked about documentation, he laughed. "Documentation is for people who follow rules," he said. "We make the rules." Today, that general's accounts are frozen in Miami, Madrid, and London. His real estate, 3 condos in Brickell, a villa in Marbella, is under seizure orders. Maria is cooperating with American investigators trading information for immunity. She's not alone. Dozens of Venezuelan elites are facing the same choice: cooperate with the new order or watch their fortunes disappear into the international sanctions machine. This is how modern regime change actually works. Not just with missiles and Marines, but with frozen assets and canceled insurance policies. The military operation was the headline. The financial operation is the mechanism. What most people get wrong about Venezuela is thinking this is about democracy, about human rights, about liberating an oppressed population. Those things may be true. They may be genuine goals. But they're not the reason this operation happened now. The reason is 300 billion barrels. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Iran and Iraq combined. For decades, those reserves were locked into the dollar system priced in American currency, flowing through American-aligned financial networks, generating demand for dollars that kept the entire architecture stable. Then Maduro started talking to Beijing. Chen Wei is a 52-year-old logistics executive who runs operations at the port of Chancay in Peru. The port just opened in 2024. It's Chinese-built, Chinese-operated, and designed to handle exports from 6 South American countries directly to Asia. Standing in his control center overlooking the Pacific, Chen watches container ships that never touch American waters, never clear American ports, never enter American financial systems. Soy from Brazil, copper from Chile, minerals from Peru, all flowing to China through infrastructure that Washington cannot monitor or control. Chen was in a strategy meeting in Shanghai when news of the Venezuela operation broke. The room went silent. Everyone understood immediately what it meant. "Venezuela is the signal," his director said quietly. "They're telling us there are limits." The port of Chancay represents everything American strategists fear about China's expansion in Latin America. Not military bases, not political alliances, but infrastructure. Ports, railroads, payment systems. The physical architecture of trade that determines who profits and who gets cut out. Here's the second question that should be keeping analysts awake at night. If China becomes South America's dominant trading partner, and it's already larger than the United States in most major economies, what happens to the Monroe Doctrine? What happens to American influence in its own hemisphere? The numbers are staggering. China-Latin America trade hit $518 billion in 2024. That's not a projection. That's what happened. Growth rate 30% annually. 20 years ago, China was 2% of Latin American exports. Today, Beijing is the largest trading partner for Brazil, Peru, Chile, and a dozen other nations. 22 out of 33 Latin American and Caribbean countries have joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. This isn't trade statistics. This is a continental realignment happening in real time. Roberto Alvarez is a 67-year-old shipping executive in Panama City who has watched this shift unfold over 3 decades. He still remembers when American companies dominated every major port contract in the region, when American banks cleared every significant transaction, when American insurance companies covered every cargo vessel. That world is gone, Roberto told me last month sitting in an office overlooking the canal. My grandchildren will do business in yuan. They're already learning Mandarin. Roberto isn't bitter about this. He's pragmatic. He's positioning his company to work with whoever controls the next era of hemispheric trade. But he's also watching Venezuela very carefully. Because what happens there will tell him which way to bet. The operation wasn't about Maduro. Maduro was the excuse. The operation was about drawing a line, telling Beijing and everyone else that there are limits to how far economic expansion can go before Washington responds with force. Trump said it explicitly at his press conference. He said American oil companies would go into Venezuela, rebuild the infrastructure, and extract wealth as his exact word, reimbursement. Rubio walked it back within 24 hours. Said this is about governance, not resources. Said the United States doesn't need Venezuelan oil. Both statements are true. Both statements are incomplete. And the contradiction between them reveals more about what's actually happening than any official policy document ever will. The United States doesn't need Venezuelan oil today, but it needs control over that oil. It needs those 300 billion barrels to stay inside the dollar system. It needs to ensure that when production eventually recovers, and with proper investment, those barrels flow through American-aligned networks, priced in American currency, reinforcing the financial architecture that has underwritten American power for 50 years. What happens if that architecture breaks? What happens if major oil producers start pricing in yuan, in rubles, in anything other than dollars? What happens to the currency? You hold the debt your government carries, the prices you pay for everything. That's not a theoretical question anymore. That's the question this operation was designed to answer. And the answer is just beginning to unfold. To understand what's really happening in Venezuela, you need to understand a system that most people have never heard of. A system so elegant, so invisible, and so powerful that it has shaped global economics for 50 years without most citizens knowing it exists. It's called the petrodollar, and it's the reason the United States can do things no other country can do. Here's how it works, explained simply. Imagine you run a grocery store. Every customer who walks through your door has to pay in your currency. Let's call them storebucks. Before they can buy anything, they have to exchange their money for storebucks. This creates automatic demand for your currency. As long as people need groceries, they need your money. Now imagine your store is the only place in town that sells oil, the single most essential commodity on Earth. Every factory, every vehicle, every power plant, every military on the planet needs what you're selling. And they all have to buy it in your currency. That's the petrodollar system. Since 1974, global oil has been priced almost exclusively in US dollars. This means every country that needs oil, which is every country, needs to hold dollars to buy it. That demand allows the United States to print money without immediate inflation, borrow cheaply when other nations couldn't, and finance deficits that would collapse any other economy. The dollar isn't strong because America has the best economy. The dollar is strong because the world has no choice but to use it. James Crawford understands this better than most. He's a 64-year-old currency trader who has worked on Wall Street since 1983. He still remembers the day his mentor explained the real source of American financial power. Forget GDP, the old man told him. Forget manufacturing, forget innovation, forget all the things they teach in economics class. The only number that matters is how many countries need dollars to survive. As long as that number stays high, America stays on top. James has repeated that lesson to young traders for 40 years. It has never stopped being true. But here's the question that should concern everyone watching. What happens when that number starts falling? The petrodollar system didn't emerge naturally. It was constructed deliberately through a specific deal at a specific moment in history. 1974. The United States had just abandoned the gold standard. The dollar was in crisis. Inflation was surging. America's economic credibility was collapsing. Then, Henry Kissinger flew to Saudi Arabia and negotiated one of the most consequential agreements of the 20th century. The terms were simple. Saudi Arabia would price all its oil exclusively in dollars and invest its surplus revenues in U.S. Treasury bonds. In exchange, America would provide military protection and security guarantees to the Saudi regime. Every other major oil producer followed Saudi Arabia's lead. OPEC standardized dollar pricing. The global oil market became, in effect, a dollar market. Picture a diagram showing oil flowing from the Middle East to the world, and dollars flowing back to American banks and treasury bonds. That circular flow has sustained American financial dominance for 5 decades. But the diagram is changing. What most people get wrong about the petrodollar is thinking it's permanent. They assume the dollar's dominance is natural, inevitable, a feature of the global economy that can't be altered. That assumption is dangerously outdated. The fractures started small. In 2015, Russia and China began settling some energy trades in yuan. In 2018, Iran started accepting euros for oil. In 2022, Saudi Arabia opened discussions with Beijing about yuan-denominated sales. In 2023, Brazil and China agreed to trade in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. Each fracture was dismissed as insignificant, a rounding error, a symbolic gesture with no real impact. Then, in late 2024, Saudi Arabia refused to renew its exclusive dollar agreement with the United States. The agreement that had anchored the petrodollar for 50 years. Gone. Fatima Al-Hassan is a 47-year-old petroleum analyst in Dubai who tracks these shifts professionally. She remembers the exact moment the Saudi announcement crossed her terminal. "Everyone in my office stopped talking," she recalls. "We just stared at the screen. We knew what it meant. The Saudis weren't abandoning the dollar, not yet. But they were telling the world that the marriage was no longer exclusive. They were open to other suitors." The suitor, of course, is China, and China's courtship of global energy suppliers is relentless. Here's the mechanism of that courtship because it matters for understanding Venezuela. China has built an alternative financial architecture specifically designed to bypass dollar systems. It's called CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. Think of it as China's answer to SWIFT, the Western-dominated network that processes most international transactions. CIPS allows countries to trade with China without touching dollars, without clearing through American banks, without subjecting themselves to American sanctions or surveillance. For countries that have difficult relationships with Washington, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, CIPS is an escape hatch. Venezuela was preparing to use it. According to multiple intelligence assessments, Maduro's government was negotiating to integrate fully into CIPS to price Venezuelan oil in a basket of currencies led by the yuan, to demonstrate that the world's largest oil reserves could operate completely outside the dollar system. If that had happened, the precedent would have been devastating. Remember Carlos Mendoza, the petroleum engineer who fled to Houston? He still has contacts inside PDVSA, the Venezuelan state oil company. Last year, one of them told him about meetings with Chinese financial officials, discussions about restructuring Venezuela's oil sales, plans to route payments through Shanghai instead of New York. They were serious, Carlos told me. This wasn't just talk. They had timelines, technical specifications, pilot programs. They were months away from implementation. Months away from proving that you could sit on 300 billion barrels of oil and price them outside the dollar. Now pause and think about what that means. If Venezuela succeeded, other countries would follow. Nations unhappy with American foreign policy, nations under sanctions, nations simply looking for better terms, they would all have a template, a proof of concept, evidence that dollar independence was possible. The demand for dollars would fall. The ability to print money without consequence would erode. The cost of servicing American debt, which currently exceeds $34 trillion, would skyrocket as interest rates adjusted to reflect diminished demand. This isn't abstract economics. This is the mechanism by which American power sustains itself. And Venezuela was threatening to crack it open. Here's where South America enters the picture. Because Venezuela isn't acting alone. Chen Wei, the port manager in Peru we met earlier, is part of a much larger infrastructure network. China hasn't just been trading with Latin America. China has been building Latin America. The numbers tell the story. China-Latin America trade hit $518 billion in 2024. Chinese companies now own or operate major ports in Peru, Brazil, Panama, and Ecuador. The Belt and Road Initiative has enrolled 22 Latin American and Caribbean nations. Chinese banks have provided over $140 billion in loans to the region since 2005. Picture a map of South America with Chinese investments highlighted, ports glowing on both coasts, railways connecting the interior, mines, power plants, telecommunications networks, all financed by Beijing, all creating dependencies that tilt the continent away from Washington. This is the context for Venezuela. Not an isolated rogue state, but a node in an expanding network that threatens American hemispheric dominance. Elena Vargas is a 39-year-old trade analyst in Bogotá who advises Colombian businesses on international partnerships. She's watched the ground shift beneath her feet over the past decade. 10 years ago, every major deal went through American companies, American banks, American law firms, Elena explains. Today my clients ask me about Chinese partners first. They want access to Chinese markets, Chinese financing, Chinese technology. The center of gravity has moved. Elena isn't anti-American. She's pragmatic. She follows the money because that's her job. And the money is flowing east. This is what Secretary of State Marco Rubio inherited when he took office. A hemisphere drifting away from American influence, a financial system fracturing at its foundation, and a Venezuelan government preparing to demonstrate that the dollar's grip could be broken. Rubio's background is Latin America. His expertise is hemispheric strategy, and his response has been consistent: reassert American leverage through whatever means necessary. The Venezuela operation wasn't about human rights. It wasn't about democracy. Those were the justifications, the language that resonates with American voters and international audiences. The operation was about closing an escape hatch, about preventing a precedent, about ensuring that 300 billion barrels of oil remain locked inside the dollar system before the next country tries to leave. The military action was the visible component. The real operation is financial sanctions, asset freezes, insurance cancellations, payment system exclusions, a systematic campaign to make dollar independence economically unsurvivable. Roberto Alvarez, the shipping executive in Panama, has watched these mechanisms deploy in real time. Ships that carried Venezuelan oil now sit idle because no insurer will cover them. Accounts that processed Venezuelan payments are frozen because no bank will clear them. The financial isolation is more devastating than any military strike. You don't need to invade a country to control it, Roberto observed. You just need to control its access to the global economy. Everything else follows. This is how modern economic warfare works. The United States provides military pressure. Europe provides financial isolation. Together, they create a system where resistance becomes unsustainable. But here's the twist nobody is discussing openly. The same mechanisms that give America leverage also create vulnerabilities. If the dollar system depends on forced participation, if countries use dollars not because they want to, but because they have no alternative, then every alternative that emerges weakens the entire structure. China is building alternatives. BRICS is building alternatives. Even traditional allies are quietly diversifying their currency holdings. The Venezuela operation may succeed in the short term. It may lock those 300 billion barrels back into the dollar framework. It may demonstrate that escape has consequences. But it also demonstrates something else. It demonstrates that the system requires force to maintain. It demonstrates that dollar dominance is no longer natural or voluntary. It demonstrates that America is willing to use military power to preserve financial architecture. And every country watching is drawing conclusions about what that means for their own sovereignty. The mechanism is clear, the stakes are existential, and the next phase, what happens after the arrest. After the press conferences, after the headlines move on, will determine whether this operation stabilized the system or accelerated its fracture. That determination is already underway in boardrooms, in government ministries, in military planning sessions across the world. Now let me show you the gap between what you were told and what actually happened. The public narrative is clean, simple, satisfying. A dictator oppressed his people. America intervened. Democracy will be restored. Justice served. That narrative is a story. Here's the mechanism. On the morning the operation launched, 2 press conferences happened within hours of each other. The first was Trump's. The second was Rubio's. If you watched both carefully, you saw something remarkable. They contradicted each other on the most fundamental question of the entire operation. Trump said American oil companies would go into Venezuela. He said they would rebuild infrastructure and extract wealth. He used a specific word, reimbursement. America would take Venezuelan oil as reimbursement for the cost of the operation. 24 hours later, Rubio stood at the same podium and said something entirely different. This isn't about resources, he insisted. The United States doesn't need Venezuelan oil. This is about governance, about democracy, about the Venezuelan people. Pause this video for a moment and think about what that contradiction means. Either Trump misspoke about the fundamental purpose of a military operation, which seems unlikely given how specific his language was, or Rubio was managing diplomatic fallout from Trump, saying the quiet part out loud. Either the president doesn't understand his own policy, or the Secretary of State is providing cover for objectives that can't be stated publicly. Both men were telling a version of the truth. Neither was telling the complete truth. And the complete truth is what this video is about. Vanessa Ruiz was watching both press conferences from her apartment in Miami. She's a 53-year-old former PDVSA executive who fled Venezuela in 2017 after refusing to participate in what she calls the dismantling. She knows the Venezuelan oil industry from the inside, the contracts, the infrastructure, the players. When Trump said reimbursement, Vanessa laughed bitterly. Reimbursement, she repeated to me later. That's a nice word for what they're planning. The entire Venezuelan oil sector is about to be restructured. New contracts, new operators, new ownership structures, and the Venezuelan people, they'll be told it's for their own good while the profits flow north. Vanessa isn't anti-American. She's been in Miami for 8 years, built a consulting business, pays American taxes. But she's also watched this pattern before in other countries, in other decades. The language changes. The mechanism doesn't. Here's what's actually happening on the ground. Within 72 hours of the operation, American oil executives were already in meetings about Venezuelan assets. Not public meetings, private discussions in Houston boardrooms, conference calls with State Department officials, preliminary conversations about which companies get access to which fields. Marcus Chen is a 41-year-old energy consultant who facilitates these conversations. He doesn't work for the government, but he works adjacent to it, the space where policy and profit intersect. He was in one of those early meetings. The speed was stunning. Marcus told me on condition I not name his firm. Usually these things take months of preparation. This time it felt like the contracts were drafted before the missiles launched. Someone had been planning this for a long time. Picture a timeline. The military operation takes days. The diplomatic statements take weeks. But the contracts, the documents that determine who actually profits, those were being negotiated before the operation even became public. This is what modern regime change looks like. The bombs are almost an afterthought. The real action happens in legal offices and banking systems, in insurance markets and shipping registries. By the time the public understands what happened, the economic architecture is already locked in place. What most people get wrong about Venezuela is thinking this operation was reactive. They think Maduro did something, threatened the hemisphere, aligned too closely with China, crossed some line, and America responded. That's backwards. The operation was proactive. It was planned, prepared, positioned long before any public justification emerged. The justifications were selected to match the objectives, not the other way around. Remember James Crawford, the currency trader who learned that dollar demand is the only number that matters. He's been watching financial flows around Venezuela for months. What he saw told him the operation was coming before any news network reported it. Money doesn't lie, James explained. In the weeks before the operation, there was unusual activity in energy futures and shipping insurance markets and currency positions connected to Venezuelan trade. Someone knew, multiple someones. The market was pricing in regime change before the regime changed. James can't prove coordination. He can only show correlation patterns of financial activity that make sense only if you knew what was about to happen. Whether that's insider knowledge, sophisticated analysis, or criminal conspiracy, he can't say. But the patterns exist, and they tell a story that isn't in any official statement. Now, here's the turn. Here's where the operation reveals something darker than simple resource extraction. Elena Gutierrez is a 46-year-old nurse in Maracaibo, Venezuela's second-largest city. She wasn't an activist, wasn't political, just someone trying to survive in a collapsed economy. She earned roughly $12 a month, not enough to buy medicine for her diabetic patients, not enough to feed her own children. When the operation happened, Elena felt hope for the first time in years. Maybe things would finally change. Maybe the hospitals would have supplies again. Maybe her salary would mean something. Then she watched the American press conference, and she heard the word reimbursement. "They're not coming to help us," Elena told her sister that night. "They're coming to take what's left. We're just the excuse." Elena may be wrong. American intervention may ultimately improve Venezuelan lives. Investment may flow. Infrastructure may be rebuilt. The economy may recover. But here's the rage moment that should sit with you. The Venezuelan people have already paid. They paid through hyperinflation that destroyed their savings. They paid through collapsed hospitals and empty pharmacies. They paid through hunger, through exile, through watching their children leave for other countries. 7 million Venezuelans have fled the largest displacement crisis in the Western Hemisphere's history. They paid for the corruption of their own elites. They paid for the mismanagement of their own government. They paid for geopolitical games played over their heads by powers that never asked their permission. Now American companies will extract their oil as reimbursement, and the Venezuelan people will be told to be grateful. The elites who looted the country, they're fine. Remember Maria Santos, the banker who managed accounts for generals and officials. Her clients moved billions offshore while ordinary Venezuelans couldn't afford bread. Those billions are now leveraged. Cooperate with the new order and keep your money, resist, and lose everything. The system isn't punishing the people who destroyed Venezuela. It's recruiting them. This is how it always works. The people who profit from crisis are never the people who suffer through it. The decision makers cut deals while the nurses and teachers and engineers absorb the consequences. And now, let me show you the layer beneath even this. Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about sending a message to every country in the hemisphere and every country watching from beyond. Chen Wei, the port manager in Peru, received new instructions from his superiors in Shanghai within days of the operation. The instructions were clear: accelerate infrastructure completion, diversify shipping routes, reduce dependency on any single pathway that American pressure could disrupt. "Venezuela told us what the rules are now," Chen explained. "If you drift too far toward China, if you threaten dollar systems, if you become a node in our supply chain, there are consequences, military consequences. So we adjust." China isn't retreating. China is adapting, hardening, building redundancy into systems that America might target. The Venezuela operation didn't scare Beijing. It educated them. Here's the question nobody in Washington seems to be asking. What happens when the lesson you're teaching makes your adversary stronger? Every action has a reaction. Pressure creates counter-pressure. The more aggressively America defends the dollar system, the more urgently China builds alternatives. The more visibly America uses force for economic objectives, the more justification Beijing has for its own assertive moves. Picture two diagrams side by side. On the left, American military and financial pressure radiating outward, targeting anyone who threatens dollar dominance. On the right, Chinese infrastructure and payment systems spreading in response, offering escape hatches to anyone willing to take the risk. These diagrams are converging. The space between them is shrinking. And Venezuela just accelerated that convergence. Miguel Torres is a 58-year-old strategic analyst in Mexico City who advises Latin American governments on managing great power competition. He's watched this dynamic build for 20 years. What he sees now alarms him. The United States is trying to freeze a system that's already melting, Miguel observed. Every intervention buys time but accelerates the underlying shift. They're not preventing the transition. They're making it more chaotic when it finally comes. Miguel doesn't know when the transition happens. Nobody does. But he's certain of the direction. The dollar system is fracturing. American hemispheric dominance is eroding. The interventions might delay the outcome, but they can't reverse the trajectory. And here's the final twist of this section. The contrarian point that challenges everything you might assume. The Venezuela operation might not even achieve its primary objective. Oil companies need stability to invest billions in infrastructure. Stability requires legitimate governance. Legitimate governance requires either genuine democratic transition or effective authoritarian control. Venezuela currently has neither. The Maduro government is gone, but nothing coherent has replaced it. The opposition is fragmented. Regional military commanders are assessing their options. Criminal networks that filled the vacuum of state collapse aren't surrendering territory. The institutions needed to enforce contracts, protect investments, guarantee security, they don't exist. What happens if Venezuela becomes another Libya, another Iraq? A perpetual failed state where extraction is impossible because nobody controls the ground. Carlos Mendoza, the engineer in Houston, has been fielding calls from former colleagues still inside Venezuela. The picture they paint isn't optimistic. The refineries need years of work, Carlos told me. Years and billions of dollars. But who's going to invest that money when nobody knows who'll be in charge next month? The Americans removed Maduro. They didn't solve anything. Markets are betting on the optimistic scenario: smooth transition, cooperative government, rapid infrastructure recovery. That bet has been wrong before. Iraq's oil was supposed to pay for its own reconstruction. It didn't. Libya was supposed to stabilize after Gaddafi. It didn't. Afghanistan was supposed to transition to functional governance. It didn't. Removing governments is easy. Building states is extraordinarily difficult. And the Venezuelan people, the Elena Gutierrezes watching from Maracaibo, the Carlos Mendozas watching from Houston, will live with whatever outcome emerges, regardless of whether it matches anyone's optimistic scenario. The operation is complete. The occupation of consequences has just begun. The operation ended in days. The consequences will unfold over decades. This is how nations are reshaped, not through single dramatic moments, but through years of accumulated decisions, each one small enough to ignore, collectively devastating enough to transform everything. Venezuela won't collapse suddenly. It will be restructured slowly, methodically, while the world watches other headlines. Let me show you what the next 10 years look like. Not speculation. Trajectory. The path already being walked extended to its logical destination. Elena Gutierrez, the nurse in Maracaibo, earning $12 a month, will be 66 years old in 2035. If current patterns hold, her salary will rise perhaps to $50 monthly, maybe even $100, as the economy partially stabilizes. That sounds like progress until you calculate what she's lost. Elena had a pension fund before the collapse. 23 years of contributions worth roughly $40,000 at its peak. Hyperinflation destroyed it. The value dropped to less than $200. When she retires in 2035, she'll receive a monthly pension equivalent to roughly $15, not enough to cover medicine for a single chronic condition. By 2035, Elena will have worked 41 years as a nurse. She will retire into poverty so deep that her grandchildren will need to support her. She will have spent her entire career in service to her country, and her country will have nothing left to give her. That's what structural adjustment looks like at human scale. Not statistics, not policy papers. A woman who dedicated her life to healing others, discarded when she's no longer productive. Now contrast Elena's trajectory with someone positioned on the other side of this restructuring. David Hartley is a 44-year-old petroleum engineer at a Houston-based oil services company. He specializes in reviving damaged infrastructure, the exact skill set Venezuela needs. When we spoke last week, his phone was already ringing with recruiters. By 2027, David projects he'll be managing a rehabilitation project somewhere in the Orinoco Belt, Venezuela's massive heavy crude deposit. His compensation package approximately $450,000 annually, plus hazard pay, plus housing allowance, plus equity in the contracts his work enables. By 2030, if production recovers to 2 million barrels daily, David estimates his cumulative earnings from Venezuelan operations will exceed $3 million. By 2035, he plans to retire at 54 with a net worth north of $8 million. David isn't evil. He's skilled, ambitious, responding to market incentives exactly as the system designed. The same system that will pay him $8 million will pay Elena Gutierrez $15 a month in retirement. Picture a chart showing these two trajectories side by side. Elena's lifetime earnings as a nurse, approximately $40,000 total. David's earnings from 10 years of Venezuelan work, $8 million. The ratio is 200 to 1. For every dollar Elena earns caring for sick Venezuelans, David earns $200 extracting their country's wealth. This is who wins and who loses. Not because of talent or effort or moral worth, because of positioning, because of which side of the extraction equation you stand on. What most people get wrong about resource extraction is thinking it creates shared prosperity. They imagine oil wealth trickling down, raising all boats, transforming poor nations into rich ones. History tells a different story. Iraq had the world's fifth largest oil reserves when America invaded in 2003. 22 years later, Iraqi oil production has increased substantially. So has poverty. So has unemployment. So has infrastructure decay. The oil flows. The wealth concentrates. The population struggles. Libya had Africa's largest proven reserves when NATO intervened in 2011. 14 years later, the country remains fractured production, erratic governance, non-existent. Multiple governments claim authority. None deliver services. The oil still moves when pipelines aren't sabotaged, but it moves into offshore accounts, not Libyan schools and hospitals. Venezuela fits this pattern with disturbing precision. The oil will eventually flow again. The question is where it flows to. Here's the mechanism that determines that flow. When oil companies invest billions in infrastructure, they demand security for those investments. Security means contracts that survive government changes. It means legal frameworks that protect foreign ownership. It means dispute resolution mechanisms that favor international investors over domestic claims. These protections are being negotiated right now while the world focuses on political transition. By the time Venezuelans elect a new government, if they're allowed to elect one, the economic architecture will already be locked in place. 50-year contracts, binding arbitration clauses, revenue-sharing formulas that guarantee investor returns before domestic needs are addressed. This is what Maria Santos, the banker who managed elite accounts, understands intimately. She's been approached by American law firms seeking her knowledge of Venezuelan financial structures. They're not investigating corruption. They're mapping opportunities. The same accounts that funneled stolen money will funnel extraction profits, Maria told me. Different names, same routes, same destinations. The system doesn't change. It just changes owners. By 2035, Maria projects she'll be managing compliance for a major energy firm's Venezuelan operations. Her salary approximately $300,000 annually. Her job ensuring profits flow smoothly to shareholders while meeting minimum legal requirements for local benefit. Maria feels conflicted about this trajectory. She left Venezuela partly because she couldn't stomach what she was participating in. Now she's being recruited to participate in the next phase. At least this time it's legal, she says without conviction. Now let me show you the geopolitical consequences, because Venezuela doesn't exist in isolation. Chen Wei, the port manager in Peru, is already implementing lessons learned from watching Venezuela. His superiors in Beijing have authorized a 50% increase in redundancy infrastructure backup routes, alternative payment systems, diversified supply chains designed to survive American pressure. By 2030, Chen projects that Chinese logistics networks in South America will be essentially sanction-proof. Multiple ports, multiple railways, multiple financial pathways cut one, and traffic reroutes through others. The Venezuela operation was supposed to demonstrate American control. It's actually accelerating Chinese adaptation. Every time they squeeze one node, we build 3 more, Chen explained. They're teaching us how to survive without them. Eventually, we'll be so distributed that their leverage disappears entirely. Picture a map of South America with 2 overlaying networks. American financial influence in blue, concentrated but rigid. Chinese infrastructure in red, dispersed and growing. In 2025, the blue network dominates Venezuela. By 2035, the red network may dominate everything else. Here's the question that should haunt every American strategist. What happens when the hemisphere you're trying to control has better infrastructure connecting it to your competitor than to you? The Venezuela operation secured one country's oil for the dollar system. But it may have accelerated the loss of an entire continent's economic alignment. That trade-off, immediate tactical gain for long-term strategic erosion, defines the pattern Washington seems unable to escape. Roberto Alvarez, the shipping executive in Panama, is already positioning for this shift. His grandchildren are learning Mandarin, not because he's anti-American, but because he's pragmatic. He sees where the contracts will come from in 20 years. By 2035, Roberto projects that his company will derive 60% of its revenue from Asian trade routes and Chinese-affiliated shipping networks. American business will still matter, but it won't dominate. The center of gravity will have moved, and Roberto will have moved with it. I learned this from my father, Roberto told me. He saw the British fade. He saw the Americans rise. Now I'm watching the next transition. You don't fight these things. You adapt. But here's the twist that complicates any simple narrative of American decline. The Venezuela operation wasn't just about Venezuela. It was a signal, and signals travel. Every Latin American government is now calculating differently. Ecuador, which signed a free trade agreement with China in 2024, is reconsidering the pace of implementation. Nicaragua, which aligned closely with Beijing, is quietly opening back channels to Washington. Even Brazil, China's largest regional partner, is hedging its bets. Fear is a form of leverage, and the Venezuela operation generated enormous fear. Miguel Torres, the strategic analyst in Mexico City, has been fielding calls from government officials across the region. They all want to know the same thing. Are we next? How close is too close to China? Where exactly is the line that triggers American intervention? The uncertainty is the point, Miguel explained. Washington doesn't need to intervene everywhere. They just need everyone to believe they might. That belief shapes behavior more effectively than any treaty or trade agreement. By 2030, Miguel projects that Latin American governments will pursue a careful balancing strategy, maintaining Chinese economic relationships while avoiding the political alignments that might trigger American response. The result: slower integration with Beijing, continued dependency on Washington, but growing resentment at being trapped between great powers. We're becoming a buffer zone, Miguel says. Like Eastern Europe during the Cold War. Except this time, the contest is economic, and we're the terrain being fought over. The Venezuelan people won't determine this outcome. They'll live with it. Carlos Mendoza, the petroleum engineer in Houston, received a job offer last month. A major American oil company wants him to return to Venezuela to help rebuild the infrastructure he watched collapse. The salary is 3 times what he makes now. The contract is for 5 years. Carlos hasn't decided yet. Part of him wants to go home to contribute to his country's recovery, to use his skills where they're most needed. Part of him knows what that recovery will actually mean: American companies extracting Venezuelan wealth while Venezuelan workers provide the labor. If I go back, I'll be well paid, Carlos told me. But I'll be building something that belongs to someone else. That's always been the deal for people like me. Work hard, get paid, watch the profits leave. By 2035, Carlos projects 2 possible futures. In one, he returns to Venezuela, earns substantial money, and retires comfortably in Miami. Another member of the diaspora who benefited from his homeland's resources without living in his homeland. In the other, he stays in Houston, watches from afar, and spends his retirement wondering what might have been. Neither future includes a Venezuela that controls its own destiny. That option wasn't on the table before the operation. It certainly isn't now. The consequences compound. The trajectories diverge. The winners accumulate advantages. The losers fall further behind. And the system that produces these outcomes, the architecture of extraction, the mechanisms of control, the distribution of power that determines who benefits and who pays that system, emerges from the Venezuela operation stronger and more explicit than ever before. This is what victory looks like in modern great power competition. Not flags planted on territory, not populations liberated, just resources secured, currencies defended, and supply chains locked into place. The people who live in the territories being secured, they're variables in equations they'll never see. They're externalities in profit calculations that don't include their names. And the timeline for them to realize what happened, to understand how their future was shaped while they were watching press conferences and waiting for things to improve. That timeline extends years beyond the attention span of anyone who made the decisions. By the time the full consequences become visible, the architects will have moved on to the next operation, the next intervention, the next stabilization. And somewhere another Elena Gutierrez will be watching the news, hoping this time will be different, while the same patterns repeat in different geography with different names. The mechanism doesn't change, only the locations. Let's return to where we started. The headlines have moved on. Maduro is in custody somewhere. The press conferences are archived footage. The operation is already being replaced in the news cycle by the next crisis, the next outrage, the next thing demanding your attention. But the mechanism we traced through this video, the petrodollar architecture, the hemispheric competition with China, the extraction economics that determine who wins and who loses that mechanism, is still running. It will keep running long after everyone forgets Venezuela was in the news. And it's not just running in Caracas, it's running everywhere. Picture a map of the Western Hemisphere with 4 pressure points highlighted. Greenland with rare earth minerals essential for modern technology. The Panama Canal, where global shipping lanes converge. Canada facing trade pressure and economic integration demands. And Venezuela with 300 billion barrels of oil now being restructured under new management. These aren't separate stories. They're one strategy executing across multiple fronts. Secure the hemisphere, control the supply chains, lock resources into dollar-denominated systems, deny competitors access to the infrastructure of the next economy. The pattern has a name among strategists: strategic consolidation. And understanding that pattern matters more than following any single headline. Carlos Mendoza finally made his decision last week. The petroleum engineer who fled Venezuela in 2018, who watched the PDVSA refinery crumble around him, who rebuilt his life in Houston, earning in weeks what he once made in years, Carlos is going home. The contract is signed. 5 years, substantial salary, full benefits. He'll be supervising infrastructure rehabilitation in the Orinoco Belt, helping bring Venezuelan heavy crude back to production levels not seen in a decade. When I asked him how he feels, Carlos was quiet for a long time. "I'm going to make good money rebuilding what my country destroyed," he finally said. "But the oil won't belong to Venezuela. The profits won't stay in Venezuela. My grandchildren might work in those fields someday, and they'll be employees too, just like their grandfather, just like his grandfather before him. We've always been the labor. We've never been the owners." Carlos isn't bitter. He's realistic. He understands the system he's participating in because he's lived inside it his entire life. He knows the contracts being signed now will shape Venezuelan economics for 50 years. He knows he'll benefit personally while his country remains structurally disadvantaged. "What's the alternative?" he asked. "Let the infrastructure rot forever. At least this way something gets built. Maybe my grandchildren's grandchildren will finally own something." That maybe is doing a lot of work. But it's the only hope Carlos can find. Now here's the framework for understanding what you're watching, not just in Venezuela, but everywhere these patterns appear. When you see an intervention, an operation, a stabilization, ask 3 questions. First, what resources or systems are being secured? And for whose benefit? Follow the contracts, not the press conferences. The stated objectives are rarely the actual objectives. The actual objectives are written in legal documents that never make the news. Second, what currency will transactions be denominated in, and what payment systems will clear them? This tells you more about the real purpose than any official statement. If the outcome locks resources into dollar systems, you're watching financial architecture being defended. Everything else is narrative. Third, who bears the cost of transition and over what timeline? The benefits are immediate for some. The costs are distributed across decades for others. The people who make decisions rarely live with consequences. The people who live with consequences rarely make decisions. These questions won't give you predictions. Nothing gives you predictions in geopolitics. But they'll help you see the mechanism beneath the spectacle. James Crawford, the currency trader who learned that dollar demand is the only number that matters, retired last month. 64 years old, 41 years on Wall Street watching the system from inside the machine. The Venezuela operation extended the timeline, James told me at his retirement dinner. It bought the dollar system maybe another decade, maybe two. But the fractures are still there. The fractures are always there. Eventually, something cracks that can't be patched. James doesn't know what happens when the system finally cracks. Nobody does. But he's positioned his retirement portfolio accordingly, diversified, hedged, prepared for a world where dollar dominance is no longer guaranteed. I spent my career profiting from the system, James admitted. Now I'm protecting myself from its failure. That's not cynicism, that's pattern recognition. Here's the contrarian point that challenges the entire narrative we've built. Maybe the operation works. Maybe Venezuela stabilizes. Maybe production recovers to 3 million barrels daily. Maybe the oil flows through dollar systems for another 50 years. Maybe the petrodollar architecture survives longer than anyone expects. History is not deterministic. The Soviet Union looked permanent until it collapsed overnight. The British Empire looked eternal until it evaporated in a generation. Systems that seem invincible can persist far longer than critics predict and then vanish far faster than defenders expect. The Venezuela operation could be the move that secures American financial dominance for another century. Or it could be the overreach that accelerates collapse. Nobody knows. Anyone who claims certainty is selling something. What we can know is the mechanism, how the system operates, who benefits from its continuation, who pays for its maintenance. That understanding has value regardless of which direction events ultimately move. Elena Gutierrez is still in Maracaibo, still earning $12 a month, still watching foreign executives arrive in convoys, staying in hotels that cost more per night than she earns in a year, making decisions about her country's future in rooms she'll never enter. Last week, she treated an American consultant who came to the hospital with food poisoning. He was embarrassed, apologetic, generous with tips for the staff. Elena accepted his money without comment. He seemed like a nice man, she told her sister afterward. Probably has children, probably loves his family, probably thinks he's doing good work here. That's the thing nobody understands. The system doesn't require villains. It just requires people doing their jobs while the structure takes care of the rest. Elena will be fine. She's survived worse than this. She survived hyperinflation. She survived the collapse. She survived watching everything she saved become worthless. She'll survive the reconstruction too. Not comfortably, not prosperously, but she'll survive. Survival isn't the same as thriving. But it's what the system offers people in her position. Chen Wei is watching from Peru. Fatima Al-Hassan is watching from Dubai. Miguel Torres is watching from Mexico City. Roberto Alvarez is watching from Panama. Maria Santos is watching from Miami. Around the hemisphere, around the world, people who understand these patterns are watching Venezuela for signals about what comes next. The signals are mixed. American power demonstrated. American limits exposed. Dollar systems defended. Alternatives accelerating. The contest continuing without resolution, without clear winners, without final outcomes. just the endless maneuvering of great powers while ordinary people navigate the currents. This video started with a contradiction. Trump said the operation was about oil and reimbursement. Rubio said it was about democracy and governance. Both were telling partial truths that added up to something neither would say directly. The operation was about maintaining a financial architecture that benefits some people enormously while requiring others to provide resources and labor at prices they didn't set. That's not conspiracy, that's mechanism. That's how the system is designed to work, and it works very well for those it's designed to benefit. Understanding the mechanism doesn't change it, doesn't overthrow it, doesn't automatically protect you from it. But it lets you see clearly while others are distracted by headlines and press conferences and the endless performance of politics. The headlines have moved on. The operation continues. The contracts are being signed. The infrastructure is being rebuilt. The oil will flow again, priced in dollars, clearing through American banks, generating wealth that will concentrate where wealth has always concentrated. And somewhere in Maracaibo, a nurse earning $12 a month will treat the people who come to extract it. That's the story. Not the arrest, not the press conference. The reshaping of economic power while everyone watches something else. The question isn't whether you approve or disapprove. The question is whether you see it happening. And once you see it, you can never unsee it.